The state of Ohio is no stranger to bizarre incidents. Like many places, it has its fair share of unsolved mysteries, haunted locations, sightings of Bigfoot-like creatures, and of course, UFOs. But during the summer of 1981, one of the strangest and most disturbing events ever witnessed would unfold.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Dennis Pilakis, a 14 investigator and author, would be the primary investigator of a bizarre string of events in northern Ohio. But, unlike many investigations done in retrospect, Dennis was able to do so as this was all happening. It would culminate into a book he would title Night Siege, The Northern Ohio UFO-Creature Invasion. Much of what you'll hear comes from the pages of this book. When Dennis arrived in Rome, Ohio in 1981 to the farm of a man named Robert, he would note many details that something had most definitely happened on the property. There were, for example, ladders leading up to the roof of the main house, on which were coats, coffee cups, and flashlights. Scattered around the yard below were spent shotgun shells. It was clear that a nightly watch and firing at unknown would-be assailants from the rooftop had occurred. But what exactly had happened to farm owner Robert and his family? The bizarre events were said to have begun in early 1981, when a deer was discovered dead in the woods around the farm, with its side completely shredded open by something claw-like. Then, in May of that year, a group of Amish men had sought permission to chop wood from the forests around the farm, which Robert gladly granted. In order to feed their workhorses, the Amish men brought with them several bags of horse feed. However, when they returned to the site the following day, they would make a startling discovery.
Each of the bags were completely ripped open as if by something with powerful claws.
Things turned even stranger the following day.
I heard several rounds of gunshots coming from the work area. When the group left the area for the day later that evening, I saw them bringing out the body of one of their horses, which had suffered a huge gash-like cut on its side. Looked like the wounds of the deer earlier that year.
Robert spoke to one of the leaders of the Amish community to try to establish what had happened, but found them to be decidedly evasive.
They kept insisting they'd only been shooting at snakes and nothing more.
Despite this, the group returned the following day, a new horse with them. Their work progressed as normal for several days, until one day the group suddenly and without explanation vacated the area. Stranger still, they abandoned all of their equipment, only returning for it months later. Whatever they had witnessed, they refused to speak about it. It was around this time in June of 1981 that work on a gas line that Robert had started the previous winter was due to be complete. As the gas line was being placed into the woods, one of the workers on the project made a remarkable discovery. In the middle of the woodland, they came upon a 40-foot square patch of land that was completely barren. No grass, no vegetation, no weeds. Furthermore, 4 holes were found in the ground, each the size of a 50-gallon drum. The worker also informed Robert that he had continued with the job and gone through this patch of land to complete the work. Not long after, things began to turn more unsettling for Robert and his family. On June 15th, Robert discovered that 4 of his ducks and 1 of his chickens were missing. He began to search the woods, and that's when he found a grisly sight.
I found them, torn to pieces. Ducks with their heads bitten off, didn't appear to have been killed for food, just for the sake of killing them.
But this wasn't all that Robert found.
There were impressions on the ground where the ducks were, looked like of a huge claw mark.
Against his better judgment, Robert opted to keep the events to himself, for now, as not to alarm his family. But it was at this point that he realized something truly ravenous was out there in the woods, and its terrorizing of the area had only just begun. Only days after discovering the dead birds in the woods, Robert's 16-year-old son had his own terrifying encounter.
Late one evening, my son woke up screaming, causing our whole family to rush in his room to see what was wrong. When I got there, he was in absolute shock. I asked him what it was that shocked him. He told me he saw a face, some sort of creature or something, staring at him through the window. At first, we brushed this off as nothing more than a nightmare he's having, but what we didn't know was this nightmare was very, very real.
On the evening of June 25th, the family heard the sounds of their ducks becoming increasingly agitated outside. At this point, Robert realized that something, some kind of predator, was outside the property. He and his sons cautiously ventured outside to investigate. As Robert moved his flashlight from side to side near the ducks, who were gathered beneath a pine tree in the front yard, the beam of the flashlight caught the shape of something.
It was a black form, had to be over 7 feet tall, and had glowing red eyes.
One of the boys turned his flashlight directly at the black figure. Robert took matters into his own hands.
I fired a single shot in its direction. Must have hit it. It made a horrible shriek and took off towards the woods, still screaming. Started as a high-pitched cry and then turned into a low-pitched moan as it disappeared.
Most unnerving, however, the creature hadn't scurried away on all fours as one might expect from a predator, but had done so on 2 legs upright. Robert attempted to fire off another shot, but the shrieking creature was much too fast and soon disappeared into the woods. The family was so disturbed by this encounter that they remained awake and alert for most of the night in the event that the creature returned. And while it didn't that night, the events were far from over. The following evening, at around 2 a.m. in the early hours of June 27th, Robert was watching television when he heard the family dog start barking urgently outside the house. He reached for the flashlight and quickly made his way to the back door. He could see the dog immediately, attempting to conceal itself near the push lawnmower, clearly nervous and anxious. As Robert passed the beam of the flashlight over the yard, it eventually settled on something.
It looked like a gorilla, at least in stature, much taller than I thought, at least 10 feet high. It was human, but not human, just standing there next to the lawnmower, staring at me with those red eyes. It was growling. At this point, I could see its face much clearer. Large, flat nose, thick lips, and it had these sharp fangs coming out of its jaw.
This creature towered over Robert, its growl becoming louder and louder. Realizing there was barely 30 feet between he and the creature, Robert turned and rushed back inside, calling out to his sons to get out of bed and get dressed. As they did so, Robert grabbed his shotgun. As he was doing so, he could hear the creature moving around outside the house, seemingly heading towards the field. By the time he and his sons reached the front door of the property, they could hear the noises coming from the beastly figure as it moved. They rushed to their pickup truck and began in pursuit of it. When they reached the back of the property, the truck's headlights picked out the figure ahead of them near the woodland around the farm. Robert immediately stepped on the gas and they sped in its direction.
Around a half mile down the road, somewhere in the land around our neighbor's property, we lost it.
Despite the late hour, Robert quickly called on the neighbor to ask if he had seen anything strange, not only that night, but in the weeks previously.
They insisted they hadn't. we set off back home.
They drove slowly, however, and had the windows on each side wound down, still looking out for any sign of the mysterious black figure. Then, something incredibly strange happened.
For reasons I can't explain, my truck's engine suddenly cut out. I told my sons to look out for the creature while I popped the hood and checked the engine. I inspected the engine, checked for gas leak, and did everything I could to figure out what the hell was going on. The headlights still shone bright, so the electricity of the truck was fine. I just couldn't make sense of it.
By pure chance, another neighbor was heading down the road only moments later and stopped to offer Robert assistance. Robert relayed the surreal events of the night. As he was speaking, though, something caught their attention.
Something big was walking through the woods.
Unable to see anything, Robert continued telling his neighbor of the surreal and disturbing events they'd witnessed. To his surprise, his neighbor then offered that his own sons had been camping in the backyard recently when they both suddenly burst into the house, saying they had heard ungodly growling noises and insisting there was something ferocious outside. As the men spoke, Robert had made several attempts to start the pickup truck. Then, just as strangely as it had suddenly cut out, the engine suddenly burst back to life.
Me and my sons returned home, but we couldn't sleep, none of us. We stayed up all night, scared of what was out there.
On the evening of June 28th, still on edge, the family kept watch, studying the trees around the property for any signs of the intruders. And it wasn't long before something or things made their presence known. And this time, Robert just was not having it.
I wouldn't usually do this, but I was getting pretty angry. I armed my sons and grabbed my shotgun, and we ventured into the field where we saw the figures.
It was as they were making their way across the field that they spotted one of the figures.
It was holding some sort of light. It was dark blue in a perfect sphere.
One of Robert's sons immediately aimed at the light, thinking it could be a weapon of some sort. But before he could shoot, the light suddenly went out. With the light now extinguished, the trio noticed multiple pairs of glowing red eyes in the woodland, seemingly watching them.
We didn't take any chances. We raised our guns and opened fire in the direction of the eyes. We emptied 2 full boxes of ammunition.
After the initial burst of gunfire, the trio scanned their surroundings, in part just to get their bearings. As they did so, they noticed that one of the figures appeared to be lying on the ground.
It appeared that we'd hit one of them near a pond close to the woodland. That's when we saw several pairs of red eyes start to appear and move lower and lower to the ground.
Robert and his sons wasted no time and opened fire again. The eyes got lower and lower to the ground, as if hiding or taking cover. Suddenly, one of the pair of eyes headed directly towards the pair of eyes the family had shot at. It appeared as though one of the figures grabbed the other one before taking cover in the water.
We could hear commotion in the pond. By the time we were able to put flashlights on it, there was nothing there but ripples in the water.
Robert realized that they were almost out of ammunition, and quite a distance from the main house. So he decided to bring the boys back to the house, reload their guns, and they remained on watch from the rooftop of the house for the rest of the evening. It was the next morning when researcher and author Dennis would arrive on the property. Upon his arrival, he immediately sensed the authenticity of the accounts from the scenes he discovered around the property. And this authenticity only increased when he discovered footprints in the fields where one of the encounters had taken place. And not just one, but several. Dennis described these as large, circular footprints with 3 toe-like extensions. He also noted that the middle toe appeared to sink in deeper than the side toes. The footprints themselves were around 7 inches wide and 8 inches long, and their positioning appeared to indicate a 6-foot stride. Even stranger, while the footprints would continue for a time, they would just suddenly disappear and then reappear several feet ahead, almost as if the creature had leaped or even transported itself across distances. Dennis also took details from the family of each of the sightings, specifically the creatures themselves. He quickly determined that the creatures with the glowing red eyes and the dark figures holding the blue lights were two different entities, although he was unsure how or why they were connected. He would also note, particularly as he and his team witnessed these figures for themselves, that the ones holding the blue lights often had a soft white glow around their form. Dennis would further note that these strange light sources and mysterious black forms were indeed a common thread among many UFO-Creature encounters. It didn't take long for Dennis to witness the strange events himself. One night, when everyone was keeping watch, the woods at the back of the house suddenly lit up in a blinding light. The brightness remained for around 5 minutes before suddenly disappearing. But this would not be the end of the strange events. On June 29th, the creatures would return. This time, Robert would phone the police.
Whatever these things were, they weren't leaving. And it was clear that our guns weren't enough to not only scare them away, but not enough to kill them either.
The Ashtabula County Sheriff's Department dispatched several officers to the property. They would conduct an investigation and would indeed discover several large footprints and various ground disturbances.
They told us they believed us, but given the creatures weren't present at the time, there really wasn't much they could do. They told us to alert them if the creatures returned.
And the creatures would most definitely return. The events at the property having only seemingly just begun. Greetings everyone, Ryan Sprague here, host of Somewhere in the Skies. For over 7 years and more than 400 episodes, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast has always been free to listen to, but it's not free to create. So we offer several ways to help support our efforts and get rewards in return. If you listen to the podcast on Apple, you can click the subscribe button at the top of your Somewhere in the Skies feed to become a premium Apple subscriber. Or you can join our Patreon campaign with several tiers available. Both of these options give you the same benefits and rewards: ad-free episodes, early access to the main show, and bonus episodes and content. Help keep the lights on at the Somewhere in the Skies HQ, and help us continue to grow by becoming a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/somewhereskies, or by clicking the subscribe button at the top of your Apple feed. Thank you for your continued support, and keep looking up. It was the summer of 1981 in Ohio. Robert and his sons reported a slew of strange creatures invading their farmland and home. These large, beastly figures seemed impervious to gunfire. Not only were these creatures sighted, but Robert and his sons witnessed strange lights in the skies above as well. It was clear that some sort of highly strange hunt was on for either the property itself, the family, or both. Local law enforcement were now actively involved, also viewing footprints and damaged land where the creatures had been sighted. And before Robert and his sons could take a breath, the harrowing events continued with more UFO activity.
A few nights after the police arrived, I was up on the roof with one of my sons. He thought he'd heard something move around up there. When we got up there, we spotted these strange lights hovering just above the trees in the woods. 4 in total. Each of them was spaced out evenly. The lights changed colors from red to blue to yellow. The lights changed colors from red to blue to yellow. From red to blue to yellow. Then they became an almost dark, empty black, like a void. Like a void. Then from one of them, a beam of white light shot down towards the ground. Then a second later, we heard a blood-curdling scream. Almost sounded like a woman.
Then the lights went out, and Robert noticed something at the edge of the woods.
It was 3 forms, large, hulking just like before. The red eyes were coming towards us, so once again we opened fire.
Each time they did so, another scream would ring out. This continued for several hours throughout the night. They noticed that the figures with the red eyes were keeping well back from the field in the woodland, but there were other dark figures that emerged.
It seemed like these creatures, the ones without the red eyes, they were intentionally close to the edge of the woodland, as if they were attempting to create some kind of distraction.
It seemed to almost be a game at this point. The figures were doing all they could to get closer and closer to the home. But why?
They wanted something from us, or they wanted someone. I was going to make damn sure they didn't get it.
As Robert and his son looked out from the roof at the strange creatures, at the edge of and inside the woodland, they noticed something.
What we thought was our horse suddenly appeared in the middle of the field. But we only had one horse, and from where I was perched up on the roof, I could see our horse was still secure in the barn.
Mystified, confused, and desperate to keep his family safe, Robert made the very tough decision to fire upon the horse. And in doing so, he and his son made a startling realization. This wasn't just any horse. It began to scream and growl and took off towards the woodland. But as it did so, according to Robert, it morphed into one of the hulking creatures that had been skirting the woodland itself.
I couldn't believe my eyes. Whatever it was, it seemed like yet another attempt to distract us. Even worse, to lure us off the roof.
By 3:30 a.m., Dennis was on site. He climbed up on the roof to help keep watch. As they scanned the ground below, Robert noticed something from above.
It was a glowing object, oval in shape. Got brighter and brighter.
This is when the most troubling event would take place.
A beam of light shot out of the center of the object in it. There's no easy way to say it. It hit my son right in the head. Caused him to lose his balance, and he almost fell off the roof. Luckily, my other son was able to grab him just in time and steady him.
By the time Robert gathered himself, the object disappeared into the night skies. But soon, another object appeared. According to Dennis's book, this object looked like a red-hot coal. It slowly descended and then landed in a plot of trees close to the house.
That's when our guns moved from the ground to the sky.
They all raised their guns and opened fire on the glowing object. A moment later, the object changed its form, and it soon made the morphing horse pale in comparison.
The damn object turned into a large winged creature like an owl. Biggest owl you've ever seen.
Not taking any chances, the group continued to fire at it, watching in shock as it got up and ran down the woodline on all fours. They would all eventually venture over to the trees where the creature had fallen to the ground. They would discover a definite impression in the ground, like something heavy had fallen. But there was no sign of the creature anywhere. The events for the night subsided. In some way, somehow, they all tried to get some rest.
We all tried to sleep, but I always had one eye open and one ear to the ground.
It would be 2 nights later when more events would unfold.
I took watch once again on the roof. It's becoming pretty routine, but just as I was about to go in for the night, this strange fog suddenly appeared. As I look up, I noticed that it had a distinct wall to it, like it was contained, and it was contained directly over the house.
Incidentally, when Dennis examined the fields around the farm following these recent events, he discovered further huge footprints, some of which appeared to have 5 toes instead of 3. This time, he also noticed that the grass appeared to swirl around the footprints in a clockwise direction. On one particular night, Dennis, along with his colleague, Willard McIntyre, had their own close encounter with the strange black figures. They were having one last look at the edge of the field near the trees before they planned to join the family on the rooftop for the evening. As they were doing so, a glowing form suddenly stepped out of the trees. As soon as it appeared, the 3 family members opened fire on it, and it appeared they hit it as the form appeared to drop to the ground in the high grass on the field's edge. The group immediately ran towards the grass, but by the time they got there, the figure had gone. At this point, the two investigators threw several rocks into the trees in an effort to hear the figure retreating so that they could pinpoint where it was. However, a moment or two after they had done so, a rock came hurtling out of the woods, landing only several feet away from the group. Then, the group noticed multiple pairs of red eyes heading in the direction the figure had disappeared in. Ultimately, the investigators and family members retreated to the house. Throughout the night, the group witnessed the red eyes peering out from the woods. As Dennis's investigation continued, he learned of various other encounters around the same area. One such encounter unfolded in nearby Rock Creek and involved a young man who had been chased along some old railroad tracks by a bizarre, beastly figure late one night. According to the witness, around midnight one Friday evening in June of 1981, he was walking along the railroad as he regularly did, as it provided a shortcut between his home and his grandmother's house. In reality, the rail tracks themselves were no longer there, but a gravel path remained which stretched for several miles. As he made his way along this gravel path, the witness began to hear strange grunting-like sounds coming from the woodland that ran along each side of the track. He did his best to ignore it, but he soon began to hear them coming from behind him, and they appeared to be getting closer. At this point, he turned around. There, around 20 feet behind him, as he would describe, was a big, black, ugly, hairy creature that stood around 9 feet tall. He further described this creature as looking like an overgrown gorilla with long arms hanging below the waist. Despite carrying a shotgun with him, he determined it was of such little power that it would fail to cause any significant damage to a creature of that size. Instead, he turned and ran as fast as he could. However, as soon as he ran, he could hear the creature pursuing him. He later described the creature as walking but still keeping pace, sounding as if it was very heavy. After several moments, he began to slow down a little, even stopping very briefly to catch his breath. When he did so, he could hear the creature making the grunting sounds once more. That's when a sudden realization came to him. If the creature had wished to attack, it surely would have done so when he had slowed down to catch his breath. Taking a chance, he stopped. Much to his relief, the creature stopped also, now standing around 15 feet away. When grunting sounds came from the creature again, however, he took off running again. And again, the creature continued following with a fast walking pace. Eventually, the witness came to a pathway in a cornfield. He turned onto it and continued to run. When he looked back, he could see the creature had not turned onto the path in the field, but instead had continued along the old railroad track. And it would seem that the witness was now safe, and this crazy event was finally over. But this was not the only encounter the young man would have with this strange gorilla-like beast. Several days later, he returned to the old rail track. And this time, he had 2 friends with him. They had gone back to the area to see if the creature would appear again. After being there a short time, they began to hear the sounds of strange breathing and grunts coming from the woods. The next thing they knew, the gorilla-like creature appeared out of the trees in front of them. The boys were thrown into such a panic that one of them raised his gun and fired directly at the creature. It immediately fell to the ground before dragging itself to its feet and running back into the woods. As it did so, it let out terrifying screams. Incidentally, as part of the investigation, Dennis conducted background checks on the witness and his family with the local community, discovering that not only the primary witness, but even his friends were very well liked and respected. Furthermore, the primary witness himself enjoyed a good reputation in the community, being seen as trustworthy and not someone who would be involved in some kind of hoax. Dennis also learned that several residents in the area around the rail tracks had reported hearing strange bird-like calls coming from the nearby woodland. Many people had asserted that it was likely an owl. When investigators found impressions of the now familiar three-toed footprints, however, they were more than certain that the sounds came from the creatures they had been studying for the last several weeks. There is no doubt that the encounters that unfolded at the rural Ohio farm, particularly during the summer of 1981, are some of the most thought-provoking and bizarre on record. There are, though, many details that resonate with other cases and locations. Most of us have heard of Skinwalker Ranch, or even Blind Frog Ranch in Utah. These areas are home to all manners of paranormal encounters and activity, including strange, shadowy figures, missing and mutilated animals, strange Bigfoot creatures with glowing red eyes, and yes, UFOs. But there are some paranormal hotspots like these that are not as well known. Clearwater Ranch in Colorado is perhaps a good example, particularly events that unfolded there during the late 1970s. Not only did the residents of the ranch begin to discover their cattle missing or mutilated, but they also began to see Bigfoot-like creatures in the woodland around the ranch. And things would come to a head when the ranch owner, Jim, along with his son Joe, went to investigate. Jim would state the following about what he first saw.
There was a strange, glowing yellow light in the trees. When we approached the light, we found a strange box and clearing that buzzed like angry bees. We retreated back to the car and returned home, but later that night I saw the light again. And maybe against my better judgment, I went back into the area.
This time, when they arrived in the clearing where they'd seen and heard the buzzing box, something else was in its place.
There were two people or beings, I didn't know what to call them. They looked human. They were wearing strange, tight-fitting clothing like a flight suit that changed colors from brown to silver.
Then, things turned even more bizarre and ominous.
They sort of motioned for me to move back. I did so, curious as to why. That's when one of them grabbed the buzzing box and carefully placed it on the ground. Then, out of nowhere, one of the Bigfoot-like creatures came out of the woods and walked towards the box. Box started buzzing like crazy. When the creature reached the box, it dropped to its knees, keeled over, and dropped dead right then and there. Tell you, that was so troubling that I couldn't take anymore. I got out of there as quick as I could, and I haven't been back in that clearing since.
While these events have some similarities, the experiences were all very different, and so were the creatures. The events in Rome, Ohio, appear to be much more than merely a group of Bigfoot terrorizing a family. And what can be made of the other figures? The ones that were little more than a black form? Could these be some sort of offshoot of the often reported shadow people in many paranormal accounts? And if this is the case, what were they doing in the same instances as Bigfoot-like creatures? Is it some sort of paranormal hotspot that attracts different types of non-human intelligence, cryptids, and anomalous phenomena? We might also recall the blinding lights that came from the woods on several occasions. While it's tempting to suspect this was due to UFO activity, after all, there were several distinct UFO encounters witnessed by the family. Could it be considered that at least some of these lights were connected to something like a portal or a gateway to another dimension or realm of existence? Stay with me here. Could it be possible, for example, that these creatures were not terrestrial or extraterrestrial, but interdimensional? Another point to consider is why there might have been two different creatures during these events. If, for example, this was purely a cryptid case, like a Bigfoot, you wouldn't expect to find another separate creature or entity not only appearing at the same time, but seemingly working with the red-eyed entities. This, then, perhaps leads us to expect there really was something of a bizarre and potentially otherworldly nature taking place. One thing is certain. Should any researcher or group of researchers be able to get to the bottom of the mysteries of the Ohio invasion in the summer of 1981, we just might be able to gain a better understanding of the paranormal world as a whole. Indeed, understanding a case such as the Ohio invasion incident could highlight how such creatures as aliens, Bigfoot, or even shadow people, as well as the paranormal world in general, are all somehow connected. You know what they say, the further you zoom out, everything is connected. Ultimately, the events in Rome, Ohio, throughout the summer of 1981 remain unexplained. And they have most certainly left a lasting impact on those who investigated it. And of course, for Robert and his sons who experienced it firsthand.
I don't know what it was that invaded our property that summer, or why, but I can tell you that we fought like hell so that we didn't become the hunted, so that we didn't find out just exactly what they wanted, because I truly fear it wasn't anything good. And the fact that we may have even killed some of them, my biggest fear is that one day they'll come back. We'll be ready if they do, that's for damn sure. We will be ready.
This episode was co-researched and written by Marcus Loth. To learn more, visit UFOinsight.com. Please take a moment to rate and review Somewhere in the Skies on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get the show. It truly does help us gain visibility and find new listeners. You can follow us on Twitter @SomewhereSkies and Instagram @SomewhereSkiesPod. Thank you as always to the Lionsgate Sound Network, but a very special thank you to you for listening. And remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
The Somewhere in the Skies podcast is part of the Lionsgate Sound Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever possible. Thank you for listening.